If you're like me, you woke up this morning, checked the news, and saw it. Another round of tariffs. And this time, cars are in the crosshairs. Yep, the US hit the vehicles and the auto parts from Canada and Mexico with a 25% tariff. And if it doesn't sound like that's a big deal, stick with me because it isn't just about trade policy, it's about your wallet. Here's the thing. We all love a good American-made truck, but the reality is no car is 100% made in one place anymore. Parts bounce back and forth across borders multiple times before a car hits the dealership, and with every trip, that new tariff is tacked on again and again. So let's break this down and see how this is going to play out. Let's start with America's favorite truck, the Ford F-150. If you buy one with a 5-liter, that engine isn't built in Detroit. It's made in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, which means before it ever reaches an F-150, it has to cross a border into the US. And that's just the engine. The steel and the aluminum used to build it, that might have already crossed the border twice, first being refined in Canada, then shaped in the US, and then sent back to Canada for final production. So before we even start assembling the truck, we've got border crossing 1, raw materials, steel and aluminum from Canada to the US. Border crossing 2, processed steel parts back to Canada. Border crossing 3, the finished engine is sent from Canada to the US. That's 3 separate border crossings, and under the new system, each one gets hit with a 25% tariff. So right out of the gate, we've added thousands of dollars in hidden costs before the truck is even built. Next, let's talk about the transmission. If you got an F-150 with a 10-speed automatic, there's a good chance that transmission was built in Mexico. So what happens? It leaves a Ford plant in Mexico, it gets shipped to the USA, and now it gets taxed. And while that's happening, the truck's wiring harness, basically the brain of the electronics, is also coming from Mexico. Border crossing 4, the transmission from Mexico to the US. Border crossing 5, the wire harness from Mexico to the US. At this point, we're up to 5 international border crossings, and every one of them now has a 25% price hike attached to it. And we haven't even gotten to the inside of the truck yet. Now we've got an engine, a transmission, and electronics. Let's talk about the seats, dashboard, and trim. All of those pieces are made in Michigan, but stitched together back in Mexico before coming back for final installation. Why? Because that's how the supply chain was set up decades ago, and it's never been a problem until now. So border crossing 6, the seats come from US to Mexico. Border crossing 7, the seats go from Mexico back to the US. Now, every single one of those movements is taxed at 25%. So by the time this F-150 rolls off the line, it's been taxed 7 different times. And for trucks like the F-150, that could mean an extra $5,000 in cost, not because the materials are different, not because the labor costs went up, but because the same parts keep getting taxed over and over again. If you think that sounds bad, let's talk about the Chevy Equinox. I actually own an Equinox, so trust me when I say this one hits close to home. The Equinox is built in Canada, but its components bounce between the US, Canada, and Mexico up to 8 times before it's finished. The engine, built in the US, sent to Canada. The transmission, built in Mexico, sent to Canada. Steel and aluminum, sourced from Canada, processed in the US, and then shipped back to Canada. The seats, built in the US, finished in Mexico, then shipped to Canada. Wiring harness, made in Mexico, then sent to Canada. Electronics, sourced in the US and Mexico, and then assembled in Canada. Final assembly in Canada, then exported to the US for sale. That's 8 border crossings now taxed at 25%. And guess what happens next? The final completed Equinox has to be shipped from Canada to the US for sale. So that ends up being the 9th border crossing and yet another tariff. So what does this mean for you? Higher prices? Industry analysts predict that the average cost of a new vehicle could rise by $3,000, and for trucks like the F-150, it could be even worse, up to $5,000 or more. And nothing else changes. The automakers try to adjust their supply chains to avoid these tariffs. That could take years and billions of dollars. Costs will still get passed on to you, the consumer. So what's next? Automakers have 2 choices. Move production to the US, which could take years and cost billions. Keep things the way they are, and pass the cost directly to you. Look, this isn't about politics. It's just how the numbers work. The way cars are built today relies on cost border trade, and these tariffs are adding a layer and layer of new cost. So next time you walk into a dealership or wonder why car prices are skyrocketing, remember, it's not inflation, it's policy. And it raises an interesting question. The next time you go buy a car, will you still buy American? Or will these price hikes push you towards a cheaper Korean or Japanese vehicle that doesn't get caught up in all these cross-border tariffs? Because at the end of the day, your wallet might make that decision for you. Have a good one.